we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And we'll rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor and up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, we rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. Oh, we're springing to the call for 300,000 more, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And we'll fill the vacant ranks of our brothers gone before, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor and up with the star, while we rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
Chapter 49, Part 2. Little Daniel began attending school. It seemed to happen in the blink of an eye. Was it just her imagination, or was time going faster and faster, thought Vivian. He was cute as a button, and he had picked up a new name for Gregory. Ferdinand had come over to visit once, when Daniel was staying for the weekend, and the little boy heard Ferdinand refer to Gregory as Morgan. Now, his small boy's voice could often be heard calling, "Mogan, Mogan," through Vivian's garden. Gregory taught him to ride horses, to bicycle, to shoot bows into the woods out of a toy bow, and to make a slingshot. They became fast friends. 2 more years quickly passed, and then Sophie gave her approval for Gregory and Vivian to take 8-year-old Daniel to Philadelphia and to Gettysburg for the 1976 bicentennial. By now, they knew a number of the reenactors, and little Daniel was the toast of the reenactment dinners. Daniel had selected for himself a small, dark blue Union soldier's uniform, and when he walked beside Gregory in his Confederate grays, they looked like a pair out of a costume party. When Vivian wasn't looking, Gregory had tied his saber about Daniel's small waist, and the little boy strutted about with it like a peacock. "Is that a good idea, Gregory?" she asked. "Hush, love, it's all right. Trust me. I have him under constant observation," said Gregory, pulling Vivian close and planting a kiss on the top of her head. "Remember Sophie clunking about with a cooking pot on her head, playing at soldiers with you?" asked Vivian. "How could I ever forget?" replied Gregory tenderly, and she could hear his smile in his voice. This year, and for the next several thereafter, Gregory amused Daniel by taking him boating on various lakes, taking him horseback riding, teaching him the basics of fencing, and reading to him the tales of King Arthur's Knights by Sir Howard Pyle. Daniel could not get enough of these stories, and Vivian often sat with them and listened as well, working on her sewing. She loved to make her own skirts, blouses, or dresses whenever she had the leisure time, or on seasonal projects for the flower shop. On this occasion, Gregory was reading the story of Sir Launcelot, who had been so beautiful of face, even as a baby, that he was stolen by the fairies. Specifically, he was taken from his mother by the fairy Naimui, also known as the Lady of the Lake, to come and live with her in the enchanted world beneath the mirage of the surface of the lake. Who knew that Sir Launcelot became the paragon of chivalry by being raised by fairies? Vivian said. Gregory looked up from the book and smiled. But of course, how else would he have become the most gentle, elegant, and courteous gentleman of all time, and the ultimate companion for a lady of refinement, surely not by an education solely in the rough world of men. But his time with the fairies changed him, and made him always a bit apart, separate from others, not entirely compatible with this world because of the more elevated and spiritual things that he had experienced there. He looked down in the book again and read out loud. And the mystery of that place entered into the soul of Launcelot, so that thereafter, when he came out thence, he was never like other folk, but always appeared to be in a manner remote and distant from other of his fellow mortals with whom he dwelt. For though he smiled a great deal, it was not often that he laughed. And if he did laugh, it was never in scorn, but always in loving kindness. Feeling distant, you would know something about that too, wouldn't you? She asked Gregory softly. Gregory lowered his eyelashes and looked down at the book again. I was raised by numerous continental tutors, an ambitious father, and then by an old book restorer, but certainly not by fairies, he said. And as for my separateness from others, it might be due entirely to personal shortcomings, and not to an excess of holiness. Vivian looked up from her sewing and opened her mouth to argue with this point of view, when Daniel pulled them back by impatiently insisting that Gregory keep reading so that they could all find out what happened next. Later that evening, when they were alone, Gregory took Vivian up to her bedroom, pulled her close, and asked her if she wanted to hear the rest of the story of Launcelot and Guinevere. You know I do, she told him eagerly. At no age would she ever outgrow his amorous fairy tales, she knew. She unbuttoned Gregory's shirt halfway down his chest so that she could lay her ear directly against his skin, her favorite way to hear any story that he had to tell her. And it was heaven to be with him like this. She smiled happily. So did they really enjoy a multi-year illicit relationship behind her husband's back? Well, yes and no, replied Gregory. I am not sure this is one of those yes or no kinds of things, said Vivian. Either they did or they didn't, wouldn't you say? Well, did we or didn't we, you and I? He asked her, his voice low against her ear. She squirmed. Oh, I can't answer that, she said. Ah, but just now you said it is an either-or kind of thing, he said with a cunning grin. You know, people have long focused on the details of Launcelot and Guinevere's alleged physical love, but most have not given nearly as much thought to the primary element in their bond, which was a deep spiritual connection. Just as Sir Launcelot of the Lake was raised by fairies, so Guinevere had also spent much time among the fairies because, as very few actually know, her mother had been fae, and Guinevere had often visited with her mother's kin. It was something they had uniquely in common at Camelot. Arthur's royal court was as refined as it was possible to get in those days, but to someone accustomed to life in the fairy world, life in 400 AD Britain was rather rough and primitive. But he was the greatest knight of his time, and had for his job rough fighting and bloody man-to-man combat, said Vivian. You make him sound like he was some sort of secretive writer of sonnets. How do you reconcile the two? It is hard when what you are good at and what you aspire toward are two different things, admitted Gregory. Launcelot was fast and strong, and happened to be unusually good at things that a knight is to be good at. He was also harder to injure than an ordinary man, In a time period that valued justice by the sword, he could be largely left alone to be his own man, since when he did perform service to the greater good, he was so talented at it. He pursued evil men, freed their prisoners, and overthrew the unjust. Everywhere, he championed the requests of ladies and defended all who were weak. "You mean he fought in many wars?" asked Vivian with a smile. "Yes, he did," said Gregory. "But he did not love having to do this. To return to our tale, both Launcelot and Guinevere longed in their hearts for something gentler and finer, and this shared longing for the same things translated itself into a deep attachment between them. Certainly they would have married if they could. From his childhood on, Launcelot would have been contented to live out his days with the fairies, and they happily kept him while he was childlike and innocent. But he was a man in his nature, and at some point the man in him could not be suppressed any longer, and he had to be sent forth into the mortal world. Many have spoken against him for his love for another man's wife, as if he was merely drawn to Guinevere because she was beautiful and belonged to another. But this was not so. At the root of what drew them together was a uniqueness that could be found in no other. There was no one else to share this connection with. In the satisfactions of lust, there can be many options, and in fact, lust is best satisfied with a wide variety of physical beauty every night. But in spiritual fellowship and deep friendship, variety is irrelevant, and it is not a matter of option. It simply isn't up to you, and spirit does not care for what worldly arrangements, such as marriages to others, that people have layered over top of these unbidden connections. Launcelot had the choice to either give his heart to this friendship with Guinevere, or to have no one for his spirit. And when you look at it that way, suddenly it becomes much harder to condemn him. This lonely, withdrawn man, who had so much worldly success, but so little sense of truly belonging anywhere, looked at beautiful Guinevere and saw a piece of faraway home. "Is it true that he never married?" asked Vivian. "Yes, that is true. After the glories of the fairy world, although he was the handsomest man and the most beautiful of face by far of anyone at King Arthur's court, it was hard for him to find a compatible woman for himself in this world. The only one that might have suited him was Guinevere, and she was already spoken for. He would lie with her or no one, he told himself, and as she was the king's wife, and he was very morally upstanding, it seemed unlikely that he would ever lie with her," said Gregory. Persistent bachelorhood was not an expected state for a knight in those days, once he had established himself at court and for his prowess at arms, and Launcelot took a lot of ribbing over it. Some made innuendos about his physical ability to lie with a woman, while others made innuendos over whether women were who he even wanted to lie with. People are not ready to hear that a man might have deeper reasons for celibacy, and from my own experience I wouldn't say it has gotten all that much better in the modern era. People always look at you with suspicion and pity, as if there was something shamefully physically wrong with you. "It must be terrible," she said. "Well, it isn't very pleasant," he admitted after a moment's pause. In any case, Launcelot's feelings for Guinevere were of the extremely passionate variety, but he was also exceedingly noble in his person, so to lie intimately with the wife of his best friend and king, Arthur, was anathema to him. But at the same time, he did whatever the queen of his heart asked of him. "So you mean that if Guinevere had ordered him to her bed, began Vivian. Then he would have come, said Gregory simply, and for a moment they were silent in nostalgia and recollection of a piece of their own shared history. And what would have transpired between them? She asked him after a bit, aware that they were speaking of the two of them now, instead of the ancient knight and his beloved queen. What would have transpired between them would have been the most tender, sensual, elevated love that any two persons could possibly achieve, he said softly. And if there was any joy from that he could give her, he would most certainly have tried to give it, while keeping them both as far from the worst of sin as possible, at the same time sacrificing what he would have wanted from any intimate exchange, taking nothing for himself. Vivian put her arms about him tighter and kissed his chest. Again, sir, I think you are swerving from the story to biography, she told him. You are so noble, and that is why you would attribute such nobility of spirit to this knight who is one of your heroes. Who knows? In real life, he might not even have been so holy. Gregory sighed. He was far holier than I am. Let us be frank. He kept from sinning further, although he could have. I was kept from sin, mostly because I could no longer commit it. That is a rather poor substitute for moral rectitude, wouldn't you say? Oh, how you twist things, Vivian said. You kept yourself from other sins that you still could commit, as I did not know it then, but as I certainly know it now. Moreover, Guinevere was married, whereas I was not, so our situation wasn't even comparable. Wasn't that the key point against the two of them? And what role did King Arthur play in their story? Just as did they or didn't they is not so black and white, so their relationship with King Arthur was also complex, said Gregory. Arthur greatly admired his wife, but like many men, he knew that she was miles above him in terms of refinement and civilization. He was lucky to have gotten a half-fairy as his bride, and it had allied him with the Fey people, but he was a leader of men and a warrior, and he struggled to deeply connect with Guinevere, although he loved her faithfully. On the other hand, it would have taken a blind man to miss the visible connection between Launcelot and Guinevere, and Arthur could see that they were suitable for each other in ways that he could not be. Importantly, he and Guinevere could not have children of their own, and he was not certain if it was his failing or hers. Who knows? Perhaps he half hoped that she and Launcelot would lie together, and that there might be an heir that he could claim as his own. Certainly he wanted to keep her happy, and he knew that Launcelot could fill in parts of her desired world in conversation and in fine company that he, a rough warrior and statesman, simply could not. Perhaps he would rather see another give this to her than to lose her to unhappiness. The fact that Arthur sensed that neither of them wanted to dishonor him made him feel charitable toward them, and there are those who have said that, although he was a mere mortal, he had the biggest heart of any of the three of them. He was a man so fine that the fairies were in awe of him, so that tells you something. No man could be as forgiving and fine as that he would knowingly allow his wife to take a lover, said Vivian. Although now that I think on it, you did suggest such an arrangement to me once. I was so horrified then. I thought it was the most shocking thing I have ever heard. He kissed her cheek. And now what do you think, beloved? That you are the finest man I have ever known, Gregory Morgan, she told him tenderly. For a moment they were silent, and lost in their embrace. Then, after a while, Vivian was ready to hear the rest of his tale. "And there was always perfect happiness between Launcelot and Guinevere, right?" she asked. "Oh, beloved, what do you think? What two lovers have ever known nothing but true happiness? They had their share of sufferings, as do all people in this world. Guinevere could not have children with Arthur, and at first she was not sure whether it was because she was part fairy, whereas he was all man, and she sought help among the Fae, but no enchantments worked, and she remained childless, no matter what remedy she tried," explained Gregory. "It was a sorrow for King Arthur as well, with no heir. She began to discuss with Launcelot if he might try to father a child with her, but he was too upright to do it. To make her feel less bitter about it, he said that for all they knew, he might not be able to father a child either, so they might lie together in sin and condemn their souls for no good purpose." "Wow," said Vivian. "And how did she take that argument?" "She wasn't very happy about it, but it had a certain logic, and so she reluctantly accepted it. Or at least, she accepted it until the day that he fathered a child with another woman," he said. "What? I didn't know about this. How in the world did this come to be?" she wanted to know. "Launcelot had been taken and raised by fairies, as you know, but he was still a man, and he was the most handsome man of his generation," said Gregory. "Yes, this I know," sighed Vivian. "Tall, dark, and handsome, am I right?" "Well, actually yes," coughed Gregory. "Most art renders him in this way. Anyways, the fathers of young damsels were constantly seeking to meet with him to discuss potential arranged marriages with their daughters, and the fact that he was the best knight in all of the kingdom and the king's own right-hand man, in addition to his features, all made him the desired catch of every young woman of marriageable age. Launcelot turned them all down, because he was not interested in their affections, but instead insisted on devoting himself alone to Guinevere. No wife could replace for him the friendship that he had with her, and he knew that no wife would tolerate its continuing once he married. So he never married." "But yet he fathered a child," Vivian pointed out. "Well, yes, because one of the young damsels whose father was a minor king tricked him into a night with her," Gregory explained. "He was seduced. Some say that this damsel created an enchantment so that she looked like Guinevere, and he thought it was Guinevere that he was going to bed with. But as I don't think that he and Guinevere ever consummated their physical love entirely, I don't think he confused this one with that one." "So he knowingly went to bed with another?" Vivian asked, surprised. "That seems at odds with everything you have told me about him thus far." Gregory sighed. "Men are weak creatures, Vivi, and it does not really take any special enchantment to bewitch them. While everyone is on their best behavior, keeping one's lusts in check requires vigilance and some effort, but it is not impossible. But when a beautiful woman comes after you and reaches a hand down the front of your breeches, and if you haven't had a woman in a very long time, and you also happen to be drunk, then it is pretty much game over, as the modern expression goes. As luck would have it, a child was conceived on this one night when they lay together." He gave her a melancholy look. "And yes, Launcelot drank. It is hard to live in the mortal world with your fairy expectations and not suffer anguish on account of the gap between the spirit world and the world of man. Loneliness, stubbornness, sadness, emptiness, longing for something that is not here, I suppose what it really is that drink seems like a spirit-like element in the man-made world. Vivian hugged him tighter. You are speaking of yourself again, I think, she told him. Probably, he murmured into her hair as he cradled her in his arms against him. It has caused me no end of problems, and had I still been the man I once was, it would likely have killed me. There is no way to really address it without finding a way to feed the endless longing from another source, a holier source, I think, which is what I learned in meditation. Few people would put it this way, perhaps, but there are things about meditation, the letting go, the drifting away, the surrendering to softness, that are in common with the effects of drink. But back to Launcelot's child. When Guinevere heard the news, she did not take it very well at all. Anger and terrible jealousy at the fact that he had broken his word and lain with another swept her, and added to it was the bitterness that he and this woman had had the child that Guinevere herself now realized she would never have. She called Launcelot to come and see her, and she layered the guilt on him and told him that she doubted he could still love her after this, and if he wanted to prove himself to her, he would bring her the child and let her raise it as her own. Launcelot went to the child's mother and demanded the child, but she would not give it, and she screamed at him and asked him what kind of a monster would take a child away from its mother. Launcelot, who had been taken from his own mother, did not think it was so very terrible, but then he began to think more about it all, and it filled him with shame. There began to be talk of military means by which to convince Launcelot to wed his child's mother, but he could not face it. His mind, always soft and sensitive, began to warp and to crack beneath the pressure he was under, and most tales tell it that he went mad for a time. His life pushed him out into the forests and wilderness to seek for his salvation as a wandering hermit. Vivian smiled. And I know what happened then. He found a very wise old guru who directed him in the right way to think and to live and to pray so that he could be well again. Well, actually, yes, that is what happened, admitted Gregory. It is kind of funny, isn't it? Oh, come. I have known all along that you are a walking fairy tale, Gregory Morgan, she told him laughingly. But what about the child? The child was a boy, and Launcelot named him Galahad. Galahad had been Launcelot's own name before the fairies abducted and then renamed him. Now suddenly he had doubts about whether the fairies had not committed a crime when they had taken him from his own mother. So Launcelot decided the time was right to reassert his mortal self and give his son his original man's name. The boy was raised fatherless, but when Launcelot finally returned from his time as a wandering hermit and his son had come into his adolescence, the two came into contact again, and Launcelot found himself teaching Galahad about all that the fairies had taught him. The fairies' methods might have been questionable, but their wisdom in many things was beyond all doubt. Launcelot also spoke to his son about the heartaches he had suffered on account of love. "What has been your greatest regret, father?" asked Galahad. "That I ever lay with a woman," replied his father. "It has brought me no end of grief, but I suppose it did also bring me you." He further explained that he loved Galahad, but would advise him to steer clear of women if such wisdom and restraint was available to him, and Galahad took these words to heart. Handsome, young, fearless, kind, holy, good, noble, and pure, Galahad became the greatest of all the knights of that era for his peerless spirit, and he was the only one who was allowed to touch the Holy Grail before it was removed from the sight of men. He never knew the love of a woman in all his time on this earth, and his heart longed ever for higher things. And what of Launcelot and Guinevere? Did they reconcile? Vivian wanted to know. King Arthur died eventually, leaving Launcelot presumably free to be with his Guinevere. But the years had broken them both and changed them. They had both suffered so much that it was difficult for them to love each other as openly and warmly as they had in the past. Moreover, the shadow of Arthur that lay over them both kept them from being together, since they both mourned him greatly, and when they were together, they felt his loss even more acutely. Instead, Launcelot became a priest, and Guinevere became a nun, and although their hearts were ever for each other, I think they simply found a different way to get there, through prayer and contemplation, and through spiritual life. Gregory tightened his arms about Vivian's shoulders and kissed her. And now perhaps is a good time to sleep, no? Oh, why can't you stay and hold me? Vivian sighed. She hated this part, and it never seemed to get any easier to bear. Nothing in this world is perfect, beloved, nor was it for any of the greatest lovers that history tells us of. So then let us be content with what we do have, and not break our hearts with wishing for additional things. As I always used to tell you, I'm going now, but I'm also not really going. I never go. Where would I go? You mean you will sit here beside my bed in your angelic form, as I have imagined it for as long as I have known you? She asked with a smile. I will, he said in his beautiful, low voice. Now sleep, dearest one, and I will see you in the morning. He kissed her again and then turned out her light on his way to her door. For the next ball season, Gregory convinced them all to spend January in Paris instead, where he was proud to be able to dust off his antiquated 19th century French and to take the rest of them around and show them the sights. Vivian sighed with rapture at the beauty of this city and of Versailles, and she happily let herself be shown around the Louvre. About an hour into the admiration of the paintings, Gregory covered her eyes and directed her by the shoulders to a work of art that he said she simply had to see. He removed his cool hands, and there it was, Canova's statue of Psyche and Eros that Vivian had first seen in miniature and covered in modesty-upholding ribbons in Gregory's old parlor in New Orleans. Up close and life-sized, it was the most spectacular display in marble that any artist had ever rendered. I feel like that about you, Gregory growled softly in her ear, in his low and perfect voice. "They are so beautiful, gasped Vivian. "Keats wrote a poem called Ode to Psyche, you know," said Gregory. "Yes, I will be thy priest and build a shrine in some untrodden region of my mind, and there shall be for thee all soft delight," and so forth and so on. "Tell me the story again of Psyche and Eros," Vivian whispered to him, "all the way through to the end, to how she goes to the underworld and returns, and then he asks to have her made immortal. I know a few months back you told me the story of Launcelot and Guinevere, and it remains on my mind, but I still think I like the one of Psyche and Eros best of all." "I wonder, though, aren't all of your stories about love really always about the same lovers?" "They might well be," he admitted with a smile, and then he told the tale again. They spent the rest of the afternoon returning to look at the marble couple again and again, from all angles, feeling for all the world as if they were paying a visit to two well-known old friends. Time passed again. Grief came to them with the passing of Whiskey, who fell ill one winter and could not recover. Vivian came downstairs one morning to find Gregory like a sad and withdrawn shadow, sitting on the window ledge in the living room and facing out onto the street. She thought at first that it was the return of his recurring glumness, but then she looked closer and saw the small pile of dark fur that was resting in his lap. "Vivi, I did all that I could," he said hoarsely. He had fed the small cat his feline medicine twice daily for months now, but some things just could not be fixed. "Here, give him to me and we will bury him in the garden," said Vivian, fighting hard to keep her voice level and the tears from running down her face. "It's all right. He was unwell for a while now. Now we just have a ghost cat, that is all," she said. For the next week, she carefully watched Gregory and how he reacted to the loss. "I won't be here to see how he deals with the loss of me," she thought. "But if the loss of this cat shatters him, I can begin to worry already that he will never make it through the loss of me. Life has not made him very tough, despite all of the wars and the suffering. How will he make it through?" The day would come when she would have to really begin to worry about it. When Daniel turned 10, Vivian began to seriously consider retiring. She asked Gregory what he thought, and he was enthusiastically in favor. "You can't possibly want to spend every remaining Saturday of forever sitting behind a shop counter. Elizabeth has been wonderful at the store, and you should promote her if nothing else. I think she might be willing to take over the store from you, now that her own children are so much older. I will also be able to help you less and less, unfortunately," said Gregory. "After a certain number of years, it becomes impossible for me to credibly show my face to the same people. The unspoken rules of the thing are to move on after a while, and to part ways with everyone that you knew from a certain period, and not to return. I broke those rules when I spoke to you in Central Park after all of those years apart. Vivian frowned. I suppose I never thought of it, she admitted. Well, you have never had to, he said. You broke rules for me, she asked, moving herself into his arms. I did. Rules are nothing when it comes to you, he told her, pulling her to him in a reassuring embrace. But you know how you realized that I hadn't changed. Well, Elizabeth will begin to suspect something similar. That is why I say that I will have to reduce my visits over there. What about Daniel? Asked Vivian in a worried tone. Will you have to stop visiting him as well one day? Gregory gave her a tender look. It would break my heart too much to stop visiting Daniel. Perhaps I could vanish for a while on him and then return when he is in high school. The fact that he is a child and still has a child's memory will work in our favor. I think we have a few more years. But you will need to hide all of the pictures of me, of course. I won't lie. It will not be easy. Daniel will come to rely more on you. Yet another reason to consider retiring. All right, well, I will consider retiring, and it is getting to be too much in wedding season, with all of that extra sewing and delivery work on top of everything. But it is going to be hard for me to let the store go, said Vivian. This is the first thing that I have really accomplished on my own like this, and I hate the thought of letting it out of my hands. Don't undersell yourself, he told her. Was raising Sophie not something you did largely on your own? That was an immense accomplishment. I had my mother to help me, Vivian said, and a wave of sadness swept over her that her mother was no longer alive. All right, I will think on the fate of the store. You know what would also be wonderful? I have long desired to go on a grand tour of Europe with you, like was done in my day by those who could afford it, he said. Every time I have taken you on a trip or to a museum or theater, I have had in the back of my mind the thought of taking you to the famous capitals of the world and showing you the best of the museums and the most renowned of the theaters. Your retiring would allow us to do these things in cities besides Vienna and Paris. We wouldn't come home for almost a year, though. That is what a grand tour means. Vivian gulped. A whole year? I don't know. What about little Daniel? She mentioned her concerns to Nadine, but her friend just told her that anyone who would turn down the chance to travel and see the world must be foolish indeed. Time passed again, and then spring of 1979 came, and it was terrible. The 17-year cicadas overran all of western Connecticut, and it was like living under siege. The run through the line of apple trees to get to the store had to be done at top speed and with an umbrella. They are disgusting, aren't they? Agreed Gregory as they arrived at the store's front door and hurriedly unlocked it. Ugh! Aren't huge swarms of locusts a sign of the end times? Gasped Vivian. Perhaps it is time to get out of Connecticut after all, and take that grand tour you keep fantasizing about. Can you check, please? Are there any locusts in my hair? Gregory grinned. I don't see any, but to be entirely sure, I would probably have to take your hair down from your chignon and to run my fingers through it. Now stop right there, sir, protested Vivian. There is a proper order to these things, as I have learned. You have to wait until nightfall, when we are alone in my bedroom, to see me with my hair down. Gregory groaned. I am quite certain that this is how women have always maintained the upper hand over their menfolk, by telling them to behave until evening if they wanted a taste of paradise. Well, I will wait as best as I am able. The sparkle in his eyes gave evidence of his humor. But on the grand tour idea, I am glad you are at last in agreement. I will get to work on some planning. No one really does the grand tour anymore, so it will require some customized preparation. I undertake it with full enthusiasm. You will love it. I will see if I can get Dita to take our horses for the time being. That November was her next milestone birthday, and it found them once more at Lutece, clinking champagne flutes, and as much in love as ever. Here's to another wonderful decade with the woman that I love, said Gregory joyfully. Do you really want to stay with me in Pepperton, now that I'm 60 years old? Asked Vivian. You mean a young man like me? Gregory laughed. Then he turned serious. I would never want to be anywhere away from you, for as long as you live, and I will never go unless you send me away, he told her. For as long as I live, and then after that you will still have an infinite number of lifetimes, thought Vivian with anguish. But she said nothing. What could be said after all? She forced a smile on her face. She would rather die than lose him, and if he was willing to stay by her like this, it was a blessing to her. To us, then, she said, clinking glasses with him, and then they both sipped their champagne. Vivian was able to convince Elizabeth to take over the store from her, selling it to her at a nominal fee. Elizabeth balked at first, but Vivian said she would not want to sell her business to anyone else, and as Gregory had his own fortune, and Vivian had her entire mortgage paid off on her house now, no one needed the additional money. The arrangement they struck was that Vivian would come and help in the store when she felt like it, merely for amusement, but that officially she was now retired. Congratulations, then, said Elizabeth, giving her a big hug. And tell me what you will do with yourself now. Will you go on a long vacation? Yes, I think we might. Gregory has the idea to go on a grand tour of Europe, and possibly also Japan, said Vivian. With whiskey now gone, it is easier to be away from the house for a while, and Gregory's friends have found us some good gardeners who could supposedly maintain the garden. I think it has been dull for Gregory to wait all these years for me to retire and to go on more adventures with him. Elizabeth blushed. You know, in all these years I have never asked you about the nature of your relationship with Gregory, but I think that it must be a wonderful one, and an immense blessing to both of you to have each other as you do, she said. You have it exactly right, said Vivian. It has been an unusual kind of relationship, and believe me, it has been odious to have strangers looking at us and wondering what kind of a private bedroom life the two of us might enjoy together. But in fact, our relationship has been more like an extremely deep friendship. No one knows me better than Gregory does. Elizabeth nodded. I do understand how it could be hard. But Gregory, he does not want a wife and a young family and all of those things. As it happens, he cannot have children, Vivian said. I think in this world, when life hands out some blessings, it inevitably withholds others. No one can truly have it all. Instead, we too are now grateful to have this. Right you are, said Elizabeth. You have grown very, very wise. You are entitled to retire now. Well, I'm not moving away, so I will still be right here when I'm not traveling, said Vivian. Thank goodness for that, Elizabeth told her. She smiled, and they hugged again. Over the years, Elizabeth had become like family to Vivian, and Vivian could not imagine her life without her assistant and friend. Vivian decided to retire from active work in the garden club, and the club ladies threw her a fun bon voyage party in the week before she and Gregory departed for Europe. Sarah Linda Greevy hosted the event at her home, and many of the ladies that Vivian had volunteered with over the years were in attendance. "You are a newcomer from New York no more," said Sarah Linda, smiling broadly. "You have become an important member of our community, and you will be missed in the club. Best wishes, Vivian, and thank you for everything." Then, when Sarah Linda told Vivian that she and her husband were selling the house in the fall and moving down to Florida, Vivian suddenly discovered that she was genuinely sad to see her go. They had never been close, but after knowing each other for so many years, it was a real connection. Vivian drove home with the gift of a giant engraved crystal tray bearing her name and her years of service to the garden club, feeling a bit nostalgic, but mostly prouder of herself than she would have imagined she would be. The grand tour of Europe and Japan ended up taking a year and a half on and off to complete, and it was summer of 1982 before they returned. Gregory took her everywhere that he had been, and also to many places where he had never been. Gregory possessed such magic at every border crossing that Vivian could hardly believe it. Working with the FBI certainly had its advantages. They went to every tourist site and picked up brochures everywhere. "It is too much of a bother to take photographs, and moreover, I will read those when I am old and cannot travel any more," Vivian told him. "What rot," said Gregory, but he carefully put all of the brochures in his suit jacket pocket for her. In the evenings, Gregory wrote up the details of all of their travels in his journal, in the second room of their suite, or in a separate room of his own when suites were unavailable. They went to Florence and saw the Uffizi Gallery and many others. They went to Rome and saw Bernini's fantastic statue of the Ecstasy of St. Teresa in the Santa Maria della Vittoria church. If any artist had ever been able to walk the line between physical desire and the desire for God, this work of art was it, the definitive rendering. They went to Greece and sailed from island to island. They went to the Scandinavian countries. They went to Portugal, Spain, and the south of France. They saw the rest of everything in Paris that they hadn't yet seen, and strolled like two lovers, arm in arm, along the banks of the Seine. They went to Strasbourg and saw traditional flat pastry go up in flames, according to traditional recipe. They went to Switzerland and visited all of the famous lakes, and they took in the views of the Matterhorn. In Heidelberg, they went to see the old castle. They went everywhere, and when the brochures and the many journals filled an entire small suitcase, Vivian said it was time to go back home and celebrate Christmas with everyone before resuming their voyages. Then after December at home, they went back to Europe with Dita and Wolfgang, and this time even Ferdinand joined in. By summer, they returned home one more time before flying out to California with Ferdinand and then traveling to Japan. The number of brochures was now taking up an entire cabinet in Gregory's upstairs bedroom. On their way back, they stopped in New Orleans and visited with Nadine, who was overjoyed to see them and who was thrilled to be able to catch up with them on everything that they had seen. "It is wonderful to travel around and see the world," Vivian admitted. "Of course it is," Nadine told her with a smile. "Frank took me to Chicago this past year, and even that was a dream come true." "See what you would have missed out on if you had not met up with me, Vivi." Gregory grinned once they got back home. "Pepperton is fine, but every now and then it is good to see what is elsewhere. And your garden did not suffer much. From here on this deck, I would say that it looks mighty fine." "It has survived better than I would have thought," Vivian agreed. "I have to make arrangements to get Heidi and Porphyro back up here again, and back from Dita," said Gregory. I am also thinking of buying a new car since my old one is struggling. Maybe a black Mercedes convertible. Or would that be too glitzy? No, it's a good idea, said Vivian. By the way, Sophie just called and said she is coming over with Daniel and Edwin next weekend. Gregory came over and took Vivian in his arms. Beloved, it is time, he said quietly. I will not be able to stay when they come. Oh, Gregory, so soon. Must it be like this? She cried, tears filling her eyes beneath her glasses. You know that it must. But I will come back into Daniel's life. I promise you that, he said. You have my word. She put her arms around him and wiped her tears away against his chest, warm and solid, through his thin shirt.